So we're gonna do brake servicing replacement today. So I just have a disc brake assembly on a stand, removed from the car. It's off of a 96 Saturn. Now, some cars have disc on the front and they also have disc on the rear, or they have disc on the front and drum on the rear. The front brakes do approximately 60 to 70% of the braking, just because of weight transfer to the front of the car when the car is stopping. So the front brakes will most likely wear out 3 times to maybe the rear brakes wearing out once. Front brakes you'll get anywhere from 20,000 kilometers up to, depending on how much you use the brakes and how hard you are on them, I've seen them at almost 100,000 kilometers, but 20,000 to 40,000 is probably in the ballpark for everyday person. Okay, I have the lug nuts on here. I've taken the wheel off, and now you have access to the caliper, the carrier, the brake pads, the anti-vibration clips, and the rotor. There is a brake hose that comes off and is normally attached to the car somewhere. The hose is a high pressure line. Take probably a couple thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 PSI of pressure. It's hooked to the inner fender somewhere, and off of there will be the hard line that goes to the master cylinder, the cylinder that's controlled by your foot. And then your hydraulic pressure will come through, push on the piston, clamping the brake pads together on the rotor and stopping. Okay? Usually my first thing I do is I remove the little rubber cap. This one's missing, but sometimes they have rubber caps on here to prevent any dirt from getting down inside. And I'll take a wrench and loosen the bleeder screw. So the bleeder screw has a tapered end on it, and then there's a tiny little hole in the side. And that allows the fluid to come up through here, out of here, and that will help remove any air, because air is compressible and it's going to make the pedal go to the floor and be very spongy. So generally I crack this loose. You know, if the car is not too old, you should be servicing your brakes every 6 months to a year. So I'll crack that loose, make sure it's good. If you want, you can also take it out quickly, put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. That will make facilitating opening and closing it later on much easier. Then I'm going to take the proper size socket and ratchet, and I'm going to remove the bolts. Remember that if you're facing the front of the caliper, looking at where the wheel is, you're going to be turning the wheels, the bolts I should say, in the opposite direction when you're standing in front. So think about which way is tighten and which way is loosen. Okay? Loosen the bolts. Got myself a coat hanger piece of wire, because I do not want to hang the caliper by the hose. Careful when you take it off, so you definitely do not want to hang this by the hose or kink the hose. So we'll put the wire in, and then generally we're going to hang it up by a suspension component up top here. Okay? Before we go on to anything else, I've removed the 2 slider pins to hold the caliper to the carrier. I'm going to push the piston out to simulate that the brake pads are worn down. I put a socket in there to support it. Do not put your fingers at any time in there, especially if there's any pressure on it. I'm just going to use air pressure to move it. And you can watch the piston move out. Okay? If you go too far, or the brakes are really worn out, the piston will pop out and then you'll have fluid everywhere. So I now have the piston exposed as if the brakes were worn. I'm going to pull the boot back and I'm going to look for any corrosion or rust in here, okay, before I push it back in. Check the dust boot. This just prevents any dirt or debris or water from getting inside. Of course, this is hanging up. I'm going to loosen the bleeder screw and you're going to lose a little bit of fluid. We can top that up in the master later. And then you can do one of two things. In the instructions, I show a C-clamp. You can use a pair of adjustable channel locks to push the caliper back in. This will check that it's free and will also facilitate putting new pads on that have lots of material. The other thing you can do is if you have a C-clamp, you don't have the channel lock pliers that I have, we'll put in the C-clamp and then we can tighten this down and it's going to push the piston in. As it's pushing in, fluid's going to come out of here. And the one reason why I do this is you don't want to push the dirty fluid that may be inside of the caliper back up into the master cylinder, cause the master cylinder maybe to fail. Okay, we're going to push that all the way back in. This one was fairly free to push in. And then take your wrench. Usually I put it upright so it's like this, and I let the fluid run out. And then I close off the bleeder screw. Take my coat hanger, like I said. Don't want to hang it by the hose, and hang this by the suspension component. You can take a wire brush and clean the inside, usually where the pads sit. And you can even take maybe a little bit of sandpaper, clean up just the outside surface of the piston so there's no corrosion, rust, debris like that. Okay, just going to set this aside for now. The pins, they need to be cleaned. These are brand new, so this was on a car that was brand new that was taken apart. The pins need to be cleaned, and if there's any corrosion on them, you're going to take them over to the wire wheel. I would clamp the bolt end with a pair of vice grips. Clean them up really good. You can use a Varsol tank if they're greasy. Clean them really good. And then we'll put a little bit of this synthetic brake lubricant on. Just a little bit. It's not open yet. Put a little bit, just a little bit, you don't need a whole lot. Lubricate the pin. Put a little bit on the threads too. And you can even put them back in if you want for now, so you don't lose them. Okay, they should slide nice and free. And sometimes they're the same size and one has a rubber boot. Try not to mix up which way they go. Once we're at that point, we can remove the brake pads. Sometimes the inner pad and the outer pad is identical. These are pretty close. They're not totally identical because the squealers are on opposite ends. And then you want to look at your brake pad thickness. So your brake pad thickness is from the metal backing right there to there, okay? Should be a 1/16 of an inch or more. And then the squealer is roughly about a 1/16 of an inch wide into the pad area. So when the pad wears down, that squealer will start to rub against the rotor, squealing. Okay, that tells you that the pads are worn down. These are in good shape. The gassing groove is clean. There's lots of material there. They're equal in thickness for both, so we're going to reuse them. Usually what I do is, if you're reusing them, you can tell by this one, it's got the round circle. That's the one that goes next to the piston. In the caliper, like that, and then this one goes there, like that. I would go over to the wire wheel. I'm going to clean out the sliding grooves that sit there. This allows the pads to slide back and forth, and I would clean the backing. These have little dampers on them. They quiet the brake pads down. And then you can also clean these, scrape them off. You can sand them clean again. Clean up the back of the pad. If you don't have a wire wheel on your grinder, same thing. You can use a wire brush, clean those out so they're nice and clean. You can take sandpaper and clean those out. Or if the pads are worn out, you're replacing them. So you're automatically going to put brand new pads in. Then the next thing to do to prep the pads is we're going to use some of this Just Brake Quiet. It's kind of a glue, and we're going to spray it just on the back of the pad. Keep it away from where the slides are, because you don't want that sticking. We'll put the little silencer pad back on, and we'll spray a bit more. Stuff's a little stinky. Okay, we'll let that dry. I'll give this one a quick clean. Clean all the old silencer stuff off. Clean out the grooves. And then I can spray this pad also. You can do 2 coats. And what this does is it sticks the pad to the piston and the outside of the caliper, so when you release the brakes, these are not dragging on the rotor, causing a noise. Okay, so that's pretty much serviced. And then we'll get out some tools. We're going to remove the carrier, or the brake pad caliper holder. You're probably going to need a breaker bar to get it loose, because they're going to be fairly tight. Okay. And then same thing, mind your direction of which way you're turning the bolt, because you don't want to turn it the incorrect way, and strip the bolt, break the bolt, or strip the carrier out. I've done that. I can use my ratchet and remove the carrier. Sometimes called an anchor plate, caliper slide. It's got a few different names. That's off. These bolts usually would be quite rusty, so I would take these, same thing, pair of vice grips, clamp them, go on the wire wheel. If they're greasy or dirty or got a lot of anti-seize on them and there's dirt embedded, you go to the Varsol tank, clean them up. And then once you got them cleaned, you can take a little bit of the anti-seize. This is just going to help you when you service the brakes every 6 months to 1 year. And just put a little bit on the bolts. Okay? I'm going to set those aside for now. Then we'll take the slider clips. These prevent the pads from rattling around. So if I didn't have those in there, the pad would click as I went over bumps if I wasn't stepping on the brakes. Usually these get very rusty, very dirty. So if they're greasy, I would degrease them in the Varsol tank. You could use also some brake clean. I just find this stuff, it's an aerosol in the air, probably not good to breathe in. You could spray a little bit on a rag, wipe them off. And then these are fairly hard to clean because they've got all these funny shapes. So you can, if you didn't have a wire wheel on a grinder at home, like a bench grinder, you can clean them with wire brush. You could also go in with some sandpaper, clean them, or you could put these in the sandblast cabinet if they're degreased and sandblast them lightly. Be careful because they're thin and you could warp them. Next part is to clean up where the clips sit, because obviously you're going to get debris, water, rust, corrosion, all that stuff underneath. Same thing, I can clean up in there, and you just need to clean where the clip goes. And sometimes I sandblast or clean up where the bolt goes so it bolts flat against the surface again. Put the bolts back in. You do not want to get any sandblast sand inside if you decide to sandblast this. I like sandblasting because it's the fastest and easiest way to do it. So I've cleaned everything. I went and sandblasted these, or I had new pads, and these came with the new pads, which would make my life easier. And then I've cleaned all the carrier contact points. Same thing, I'm gonna go back to prepare it. I'm gonna use the lubricant, and you do not need a whole bunch, just a little bit. I'm gonna put a little bit in here on all 4 areas, here, here, all around. And then you can put your clip back in. And then I put a little bit more of this on these contact surfaces. Okay? Set that aside. And then if you want, you can also put a little bit in the ends of the pads where they sit into those anti-rattle clips. Those parts are serviced and they'll be ready to go back together. Little trick, take the rotor off, and let me get a hammer. Is that sometimes the rotor will be stuck to the hub, so you might have to give it a little whack with a hammer. Now be aware that if you accidentally hit the machine surface where the pads run on, here, you'll damage it. If you hit it too hard or you hit it here, you can potentially warp the rotor. The rotor will come off. There's a measurement for how thick the rotor should be. So you want to look at the rotor. Does it look really worn out? This is a vented rotor. It's got the vents in between to allow air to cool it. Does the surface look good? Nice machine surface, level. Both sides are parallel this way, okay? And we're gonna clean the inside of the hat if the rotor's in good shape. If you're replacing the pads, because the pads are worn out down to the squealer clips, I'd recommend you replace the rotor at the same time. The rotor's probably not in good shape, probably got grooves, worn down the thickness, all that stuff. Clean the inside of the hat out, sandpaper, whatever you need to do, and then we have the hub. The hub's the same way. There's gonna get water in between here and here, and they're gonna bond. The two metal pieces are gonna bond together. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna clean up the hub all the way around, make sure it's clean. I've already applied a little bit of anti-seize like we did when we did tire rotation or putting a wheel on. I put a little bit just on the surface, just a thin layer, and then I put some around the hub. And now I'll prevent the rotor from sticking to the hub and the wheel sticking to the hub when you go to take it off. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to exaggerate now a lateral run out on a rotor. So I put a washer there. I'm just going to put this back on. Little trick, I save a spacer. I just use a nut and I put that on there, and that will allow me to hold the rotor on so it's not flopping around while I'm doing my brakes. Okay? And let me tighten that up. And then I'll show you what a lateral run out looks like. So if you look at this rotor, you'll see that it is wobbling back and forth. Okay? So that is not a good thing, because what will happen is as it's going back and forth, the pads are going to move with the rotor, and then it's going to push on the caliper piston. The fluid is now transmitted back up into your foot pedal, and that will give you a steering wheel vibration. So we want to make sure that we do not have any lateral run out where the rotor is going back and forth. I just simulated it with that washer behind, okay? But you want to make sure that the hub in behind and the back side of the rotor is good and clean when you put it together. And the rotors do become warped over time. You can machine them. So you can put it on a machine and remove a bit of this material and make the rotor turn straight again. So it's just a simulation for that. We've now replaced the rotor or cleaned it up, depending on if it needs replacement or we're just servicing, just general 6-month to 1-year service. Usually I do it spring and fall, and now we'll just get the brakes ready for the winter and ready for the summer. Put those nuts back on to hold it. And then before I put it back together, I'm going to show you 2 different types of brake pads. So this is basically the same as the ones I took off the car. These are bonded, so the material here, from here to here, is bonded to this metal backing, okay? Just glued on. Fairly reliable. This one has rivets. So when you measure the thickness, you want to measure from the surface to the top of the rivet, not just the thickness of the pad itself, okay? This one also has a squealer right here, and when it touches the rotor, it's going to start making noise. This one has a big crack in it right here, okay? So that's not good. It's going to come apart, and then you'll lose your brakes. If you keep driving the car until all of the material's gone, you're going to have a metal backing against metal. And you're going to know it because it's going to make a horrible, horrible noise. Okay? Now then, we're ready. We're going to put the carrier anchor plate back on. We're going to take our bolts, screw them in. And then this is very important that we torque these bolts down. So I have printed off both the torque specs and an exploded view of the brakes. Okay, and we're looking at, it doesn't show the carrier bolts on here, it just shows you the guide pin and the lock pin, which is going to be 2 and 3. And then on here, I pointed out at the top, it's in foot-pounds and Newton meters. And I'm going to go down. Caliper guide lock pins are 27 foot-pounds or 37 Newton meters. And then I went down further. Caliper support to knuckle bolt. So this is a caliper support, and this is the knuckle. The knuckle is what holds the suspension and the steering, holds the car up, and it's 81 foot-pounds or 110 Newton meters. So I just printed this off Shopkey for the car. So I'm going to torque these ones first, 81 foot-pounds. I'm going to get my torque wrench out. Somebody didn't back this off last time, so we'll make sure we do it this time. We're going to go up to 70 plus 10. It doesn't go to 81, but we're going to go to 82. And hopefully you can see that. Put our socket on. This is a little harder to torque because it's not bolted down. Torque those until it goes click. And this is important because you don't want the brakes coming apart on the car when you're driving. Make sure you undo the torque wrench when you're done. Back in the case. Check that one off. Our pads are now ready to go. I'm putting the original one back on, so this one has the caliper piston mark in it, the round mark. It slides on, slide in. Sometimes they're a little bit tricky to get in there. Okay, so I've slid it in, made sure it's sitting in the clips. There's little clips here that hold pressure against it. Just like that, same thing. Make sure the clips are there. Seated down. I can now remove the bolts that I lubricated. Make sure your hands are clean while you're doing it. My caliper was hanging up off the suspension components up here. Take the coat hanger out, make sure you remove it. You don't want to leave it on the car because it's going to make noise as we're going down the road. Slide it on, be careful of the rubber boots that they're fit in. Put the bolts back in. Okay. And then we're going to go to our torque specs. I said it was 27. I have another torque wrench in the cabinet, smaller one. It's got a 3/8 drive on it. So 2 different drives, 1/2 inch, 3/8. Put that on there. I said it was 27. This one goes up in 1 foot-pound increments. So 1 full circle is 10 foot-pounds. We'll go 20. And then 7. Doesn't take a whole lot. 27 foot-pounds isn't much. Okay. Undo the torque wrench, loosen it off when you're done. And then you're pretty much done. One thing I like to check is make sure that the caliper slides freely on the pins, make sure the rotor turns nice before you put the wheel on. Now then, you put the wheel on, I've got the torque for that, it's 103 foot-pounds. Torque the wheel down, and then remember that we push the caliper back so there's space there. If I step on the brakes, the pedal's going to go to the floor, probably not push enough fluid down to push the caliper over to grab the pads. So when you get in the car, you're going to pump the brake pedal slowly 2-3 times till you get a nice firm pedal. Then you can carefully drive the car again, or in the case of the shop here, I would drive the car. Drive it around the block, make sure everything's okay, come back, retorque the wheels, and I would lift the hood and check the brake fluid in the reservoir under the hood. I'm not going to do that in this video, but that should give you a good idea of how to service disc brakes.